During the 10 or so years that Playmates held the license to Star Trek, they produced the most diverse array of Star Trek figures we've ever had. Not only did they make a figure of every single character you could think of, and produce ships, playsets in their 4-inch scale, but they also experimented with multiple scales. They had a pretty successful 9-inch scale, a 12-inch scale, they even experimented with minifigures and micro playsets, as well as a one-off 6-inch scale line to celebrate First Contact. And then there was one final experimental line, the Space Talk line, and this scale was 7 inches. These figures would be mostly scaled up versions of their 4-inch scale figures, except they would also have a voice chip in them so that they could speak. This line was pretty brief, they only made 4 figures, and they're the ones I'm going to take a look at today. The packaging is uniform across all 4 figures, so let's take a look at the Riker. Interestingly, all 4 figures would be next generation characters, and yet the logo of the font that they've gone for the Star Trek banner at the top of the packaging is actually borrowed from the classic films. I suppose ultimately it doesn't matter too much, but it does seem a little incongruous. The backing card is fairly nice, albeit a little bit bland. It is a star field, we see some planets, a little bit of nebula going on in the background there. We can see a planet up close towards the bottom right hand corner of the packaging, and in the very background we can see a sort of wormhole that's opening up, but it's not the one we're used to seeing in Deep Space Nine. It looks very different. In the bubble packaging we can see the figure there in all his glory, along with all his bits and pieces that he comes with as well, which is great. And we can see there is an increased emphasis here on the fact that this figure can talk. We can see lots of different speech bubbles to indicate the fact that he can indeed talk. Meanwhile, on the reverse, again, we can see the star field, which looks pretty attractive here, to be fair. The colours are nice and deep and vibrant, which is great. We can see the 4 figures in this wave and ultimately the entire line, but we also see some of the other bits and pieces that the figure comes with as well, highlighting his phaser and his tricorder and whatnot. And then there is a hole in the back of this packaging here with a big try me arrow to allow you to test the sound is still working. Now, when you open the figure up, I think you're going to be struck by how smooth and glossy this figure looks and feels. And this is something that has been transferred from the 4-inch scale, and indeed is one of the issues that some collectors have with this line, is that they tend to look a little bit too shiny and a bit too plastic-like. Now, that being said, these figures of course were aimed at children primarily, and I think they've done a pretty good job, especially when we start to look at the sculpts. The likeness here is actually pretty sharp. This is a pretty good likeness of Jonathan Frakes, and I feel like everything's in proportion, everything looks right, and aside from looking a little bit too shiny and perhaps the eyes are a little bit too blue and a little bit too big, other than that, this looks pretty good actually. The body mould is in good proportion to the head and the hands. It looks pretty authentic to what we see on screen as well, so they've done a pretty nice job of this all in all. They've even got the accurate pips on his collar there, which have sadly only been painted in rather than sculpted, but nevertheless, at least they've got that level of accuracy. His comm badge actually is sculpted in and then painted over, so again, that looks pretty solid, which is great. And one of the things I like about this line is how the characters scale with each other, so the Riker is fractionally taller than the Captain Picard, which is entirely appropriate. There's not a lot of detailing when it comes to the legs or the trousers, and sadly they've missed an opportunity to just paint in the cuffs of those trousers there with the red piping that we see in the show. Now oddly, despite being scaled up, they actually fare worse in terms of points of articulation than their 4-inch scale counterparts. He does have a swivel at the neck, allowing the head to spin 360 degrees. There's another swivel at the shoulder there, allowing the arms to kick up and down, and of course there is a single joint at the elbow, but there is no waist swivel. Now there is a rather unfortunate diagonal swivel at the crotch, which allows the legs to sort of kick up this very awkward angle, and then this is complemented by a single joint at the knee, which is useful to have, but altogether there's not enough here to allow you to put these figures in any meaningful poses. Now each figure comes with 3 distinct phrases, and you can activate them by pressing the button on the back of the figure.
Shields up. Red alert. Energize.
He does come with a handful of accessories, including his phaser and a tricorder. Now, although they're nicely moulded for the most part, they sadly lack any paint apps whatsoever, so they do look a little bit childish. Now, I think if they just had a little bit of paint here and there, then this would look pretty good. Each figure also comes with an individual story, which is an A4 piece of paper that's been folded up multiple times, and you can unfold it to read the full story. And there's actually some nice illustrations in here as well. Each one is based on an episode of Star Trek Next Generation. In the case of Riker, it is Chain of Command. This is quite a strange and unusual idea, and it feels a little bit like an afterthought because this isn't really produced on nice glossy paper. It doesn't feel like they put an awful lot of effort into this. It does feel very experimental. It's a nice touch, but I'm not really sure what it adds to the figure really. All in all, this is a pretty decent figure for the time, and I do really like the voice chip in it. I think that really makes this figure, but the lack of articulation really limits it. So let's move on now to the good captain himself, Picard. Anyone who already owns the Series 1 Picard figure from the first wave of the 4-inch line will immediately recognise this sculpt because it is a scaled up version of that figure. Now, as it happens, I would say that's actually a very good thing. That's definitely something in its favour because it happens to be a really nice sculpt. I've always thought that Playmates did a really nice job when it came to the likeness of Picard across all of their lines. And this figure is no exception because I think this is a really good likeness, and for the most part I think the paint apps are really well applied as well. I also really like that they've gone for this costume, this version of the character, because it allows it to stand out and look a little bit different to the rest of the Starfleet characters, because of course they are naturally very uniform when they're in their Starfleet uniforms, so it is nice to see a little bit of diversity within the line and they look more dynamic on the shelf. Likewise, you'll notice that the legs are very different from the Riker as well. They have a very different boot and trouser cuff. I also really like that they gave him that pointed finger hand as well. I think that looks really good. Again, it's distinctive in the collection, but it's also a distinct character trait. So it's really nice that we have that essence of the character core in the sculpt. Now, the articulation scheme is pretty much the same as what we saw with Riker, but he does actually benefit from having one other point of articulation, and that is in the bicep. There's actually a swivel here, which, believe it or not, makes all the difference. It just opens up the realm of possibility for what you can do with this figure, and it really greatly enhances it. I just really wish I had one in the waist. Picard also has a voice chip, and his 3 phrases are:
Engage. Captain's log supplemental. Damage report.
For me, out of the 4 figures in this line, it's kind of a toss-up between the Picard or the Borg figure, which are the very best. And speaking of the Borg, here he is. Now, on the packaging, this is labelled as Hugh, the individual Borg who's introduced in iBorg. Now that's kind of interesting to me since this figure is clearly a scaled up version of the Series 1 Borg figure that we had in the 4-inch scale, and that figure was quite clearly labelled as just a generic Borg. And later on they would go on to produce a 4-inch scale Hugh figure which would look very screen accurate. Whereas the sculpt on this figure doesn't look quite right. Certainly the paraphernalia on the head over the eye is similar, but it's not quite right. Obviously it's very, very different. But I think it's close enough. It's reasonable to be able to allow this to pass as Hugh if you want it to be, but I think it works much better as just being a generic Borg drone. I've always loved the Borg, and I always thought the classic Borg that we see in the Next Generation have a very unusual and distinctive design, and they've caught that really nicely in these figure sculpts. And the Borg figure was always one of my favourites in the 4-inch scale, so it's really nice to have this blown up, upscaled to the 7-inch. There's lots of sculpting and various paint apps on this figure that make him the most detailed and the most fun to look at visually. And some of those details that were left unpainted in the 4-inch scale now have a lot more paint apps. We can see that most particularly on that gun arm, for lack of a better description, where we can see there's obviously black and silver in there. In the 4-inch scale, it is just one silver piece with no paint apps whatsoever. Plus, you'll probably notice the figure has lots of various pipes and tubing coming out various holes all over his body, all over the torso, his arms, his legs, and it looks really, really good. What's really nice about it is that they work in tandem with the articulation, so there's never really any danger of these popping out or getting worn away, which is fantastic. Now, the articulation scheme for the Borg is pretty much the same as we've seen previously, but again, he does buck the trend. On the one arm, he has an upper bicep swivel that isn't present on the other arm. Meanwhile, that other arm does obviously have a swivel at the end of that gun arm as well. Of course, he also has his own set of stock phrases.
You must comply. We are the Borg. Freedom is irrelevant.
I think Playmates knocked it out of the park with this figure. There's so many details and there's lots of lovely paint apps to really help those details pop and just really explode, and I think they've just done a great job. Combined with the voice chip, there's something really special about this 7-inch Borg figure. And finally, that brings us to Q, the last of the 4 figures in this line. Now I have to say, Q is probably the most disappointing of all the figures. They have just sadly recycled the Riker body and put a Q head on the top of it. To make matters worse, I actually think it's the weakest sculpt of the lot, and the likeness is okay, but it's not that strong. And because they have just recycled the Riker body, it also means he's quite limited in terms of his articulation and accessories, but at least he does have 3 stock phrases.
Bonjour, mon capitaine. What a pity. Human.
Ultimately, for me, Q is the most disappointing and probably the real weak link in this set. And for such a short-lived line, I think it's a real shame that they decided to use the Starfleet uniform for this character, when I think really what would have been really nice is to have him say in his judge's robes, which I know is a very tired look, but that said, it is very colourful, it is very visual, and I think it would help diversify this line and would have made it a bit more fun and interesting to look at. And so there you have it, ultimately an experimental line that was not continued. I don't know whether it wasn't very successful, I can only assume these figures didn't sell well, and I do think it's a shame because it would have been really fun to have had a 7-inch scale of Playmates Star Trek action figures, especially with the voice chip adding that extra dimension of play, which is really fun, even to this day. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.